Welcome, everyone, as you're joining to this webinar of the Católica Centre for Thriving Futures. I'm your host, Wayne Visser. I'm director of the centre here and also a professor of practice in regenerative business innovation and technology. And we have a really interesting topic. We're glad that you can join us. We're looking at whether sustainability is faltering, and I'm joined, as you can see, by some wonderful guests, and I will introduce them now. So we have Martin Calnan, who is the UNESCO Chair in Futures Literacy and the Director of Executive Education at École de Bon's Business School in Paris, and we have Danielson and Pamela Fuhrmann, both co-founders of the Conscious Leadership Institute and One Earth Leadership. So what we're going to do with this hour that we have together is kick off with some opening thoughts, and we will start with Cam, and in fact we'll have 3 rounds of presentation of some ideas and then some dialogue, some reflection. And along the way, we will be inviting you to add your comments and questions using the chat. And so perhaps you can begin already by telling us where you're calling in from. Hopefully you're able to access the chat, and we're always interested who is joining us. Sandra is kicking us off. So thank you. It may appear that I'm mute, but hopefully you're hearing me. We have another computer in the room. Good. Welcome, everybody, as you're joining us. And to frame this discussion, where it came from, many of you, I think, will be working in sustainability or interested in sustainability in one form or another. And probably you've had that feeling that the last 18 months, 2 years, or maybe even longer have been tougher than ever before. And we do hear talk of a sustainability recession. We hear words like ESG-backlash, and we're going to get into that. And especially what we want to do with this webinar is to look what's behind that sense of sustainability being challenged, and whether we're even asking the right questions in the first place. So once again, welcome. And I will kick us off then by passing over to Cam. We'll share the initial slides, and he will kick us off then with some initial thoughts. So over to you, Cam.
Thank you, Wayne, and hello, everyone. What we're going to do here is share some perspectives on this topic. Certainly it's not exhaustive what we're going to be talking about, but we want to make it clear that this is a perception or perspective of ours, and it is something that we feel very strongly about, but at the same time it doesn't make it right. So what we're trying to do here is just kind of open the door into a deeper inquiry around this question of what is the future of this effort at creating a thriving future. And so the first thing I want to point out is that the idea that this current ESG backlash, call it in the United States, it's referred to as being woke, and this idea that is it a sustainability recession or not, I really believe this is a symptom of a larger challenge that first begins with understanding a difference in 2 terms that oftentimes get used together. And I think there's a significant difference between these terms, which we have to unpack a little bit. And that's sustainability is not the same thing as regeneration. So let me speak a little more into each of these in the next slide. From my standpoint, sustainability is an orientation that views the world through a human-centric lens. It's a perpetuation of the organization is kind of the prime importance in this lens. And the underlying assumptions to this notion of sustainability is still dominated by economics. Now, that in and of itself doesn't make it wrong. It just simply limits the opportunity of what is the promise behind a thriving future. This is where I go to the notion of regeneration, speaking to a really different paradigm. It's an orientation that views the world as an interdependent living system. First and foremost, that's the starting point. What that means is that as human beings, we are one part of this system, and that all life is dependent on the health of the system. Therefore, we can't focus on one part of this system at the cost of the whole system. So it's a much more holistic orientation to the concept of thriving. Now, behind this is a paradigm differential, which is what I go into in the next slide. Within the framework of what I would refer to as the status quo, the objectification of self and others is a framework that belies a certain kind of separation that is not in part of the notion of the interconnection of all life. So we tend to think in terms of objects. We objectify ourselves, we objectify others, we objectify the planet. And as we start thinking that way, we don't regard it with a whole life orientation. We regard it as parts that can be dealt with separately. And therefore, we begin to think about nature as something that is merely a resource for our use, as opposed to we are part of nature. Nature is who we are. So a mindset shift is really necessary to a thriving future, which means that the central question for me is how do we make that shift? Because until we make that shift, when we start talking about a thriving future, we're speaking from an orientation that is not encompassing the idea that we are living in an interdependent system. So making the shift is the first step in the movement towards a more regenerative future. That's kind of sets the stage for what's going to follow here, but maybe we have some questions now.
All right. Perhaps, so I'll stop sharing for a moment and ask you, do you think that we got it wrong from the beginning? If we look at how sustainability has been framed. So the first question is, what is the beginning, right? Because this is not a new movement. And we could say that, just need to mute somebody there. We could say that this is as old as history, right? We've always had a perspective, especially among indigenous populations, of living in harmony with nature, in balance. But if we take it to where it was formally defined in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission of the UN, sustainable development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Did we get it wrong already from there? Or was it when we started to define it for business, the triple bottom line, 1994, John Elkington, people, planet, profit? At what point do you think we started seeing it as not being a systemic concept?
And Wayne, behind all these different words is this intention of doing something positive. And it's not to deny that those collective intentions can't be achieved. It is to recognize that in the way in which we approach it, we're bringing certain assumptions to bear. And those assumptions are based on a certain orientation that reinforces the system we're in, as opposed to actually looking outside the system which we currently operate in. And that's one of the more difficult things to do when you start looking at assumptions. It begins to release a lot of anxiety about what we are willing to look at and what we're not willing to look at. And until we be able to gain a certain kind of objectivity around the assumptions we're using, it's difficult to talk about what has to change.
Yeah. And if I think about the assumptions behind the original definition of the UN, this was a political concept. This was actually about trying to satisfy both the rich north and the low-income south, and to say, look, those of you who already have developed, you can continue to develop, but by the way, also, allow others to develop, and don't forget about the next generation. That was also quite different from when we started applying it to business. Triple bottom line was then saying, look, we need to make this into the language of business. We need to find a balance between these things. And even that, I think, starts to be non-systemic, because you can't say balance economic, environmental, and social when the economy is embedded within social, and social is embedded within the planet. And I know John Elkington recognized this some years later and withdrew the concept after 25 years as a failed management concept. But what do you think, Pamela? I mean, is it really about how we're defining sustainability? Is that why we're getting this resistance now?
Well, let's go back to your comment on John Elkington. In conversation with him, he brought forward that very thing around pulling it back 25 years later. And for him, it was around, we had become focused on economic metrics rather than the energy that was behind putting this forward. And when we think about sustainability and the tie to technical metrics, everything that can be measured, what about those things that cannot be measured? Sustainability is about maintaining. What about really driving a thriving future? What does that look like differently than what we've been doing up to now in some areas?
Yes, which comes to your point, Cam, about the difference between sustainability and regeneration. Here again, this is maybe a bit of jargon. I talk about it as thriving, but what do we really mean then about the difference between sustainability, just continuing, surviving, and regeneration, which is something entirely different? We'll come to the issue of measurability in a moment, Martin, when you present. But in the meantime, what's your view? Are we getting the are we wrong to hang on to sustainability in the first place?
Well, sustainability is a concept that is clearly helpful and has actually contributed to a certain extent to where we are today. So I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the baby water, or the water out. No, yes, it is the baby with bath water. There we go. So that is, I think, an important element. I think, speaking to what Cam was saying too, we tend to forget that we live in a complex universe. And the nature of complexity is that there are unintended consequences. So I think Elkington meant well. There was no ill will, and there's no ill will in the concept of sustainability. It's just that the unintended consequences of the system, the way sustainability is then used by the system, so to speak, actually ends up feeding the system itself, rather than leading to what we hope might be the case, that is something that is thriving rather than just the continuation of the system. Once again, sustainability is the continuation of a system rather than changing the system in order for it to thrive, and in order for all of us living beings in it to thrive.
Yeah, and certainly this is something that I know John Elkington acknowledged, was that it was the way that the concept was then used or interpreted as it mainstreamed. And it's a dilemma, really, because we wanted it to mainstream, didn't we? I mean, we didn't want it to be something that is only for a minority. We didn't necessarily want it to be something that was fringe. On the other hand, we seem to be saying that we need it to be more radical in order for it to be effective. Is that what you're saying, Cam?
Yeah, I think, again, what I will always come back to is what's the underlying paradigm to the assumptions we're operating with. And the underlying paradigm here, again, is a perpetuation of the system, or of the organizations that have created identity within the system. And so if we're really more focused on the perpetuation of those organizations, then we're going to do it within what created the system. Because it's not going to, many organizations are not going to see a way forward when we start saying what comes first is not your organization, but the principles of life by which this planet thrives. And if we start there, we're not going to come to the same conclusions.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's dig in a little bit more to that system which we seem to be saying is broken. I'm going to pass over to you now, Martin, to share a few thoughts about value creation, because this seems to be what defines our modern system, at least our modern capitalist and economic system. So let's go back to some slides to share a few more thoughts.
So what I wanted, you go back a slide if you
One
want.
more, yeah.
So what I wanted to share, just as a perspective, because we talk a lot about value, and I believe value is actually, and the way we define value is actually central to all the global challenges we're facing today. And so I'm wondering to what extent our underlying assumptions actually have divorced value from life. And so we speak of value, we measure value, but in doing this, we are actually separating something that ultimately is inseparable or should be inseparable. And so if we moved on to the next slide, let me unpack this a little bit. Ever since actually Aristotle, and probably before, as you may know, there was a whole economic thought process of how do I create something that transforms something that is relative. Value is relative. What has value to me is different than what is value to you, and the amount of value that any one thing has to me is different than what it has to you. It's intrinsic, that is, it actually is it is actually contained in the object itself. You've all lost some kind of an heirloom, and an object that had meaning to you, had value to you. Replacing it is impossible. You will never be able to replace the same thing to get the same value out of it. And of course, value is relational in the sense that value is something that is built based on the relation that one has within a community, within people. One's trading or sharing something with one person is not the same as sharing something with a complete stranger. So this is something that is intangible and immaterial. And yet from an economic system, we needed to turn it into a unit of account, something that we could measure, something that I could compare, something that allowed me to exchange a house for a loaf of bread, to put it in really very basic terms, something that can store value, and it's a bit of a technical term, but something that actually can exchange different kinds of values in different kinds of ways, that is fungible, that is transferable. Well, we were able to do that. We have an economic system that's actually super successful at doing that. Again, what have we lost in translation? And so if value is defined as a unit of account, and therefore value creation means creating more of this unit of account rather than creating more of the intrinsic immaterial value, intangible value, well, what happens is that value becomes transactional. It's super useful. It's what allows so much of our commerce to go on, but it actually divorces value from life, because value suddenly becomes something that is a unit of account. It's something that is measurable. That's something that is it's a transactional value. And if we've divorced value and life, then suddenly this divorce is structured. This divorce is actually in the system itself. So once again, it's not bad intentions. It's just that this is the only way we know how to create value. This is the only way we know how to measure value. And therefore, this is the only thing that we value. And our underlying assumption, therefore, can only be to create more of that value. the typical example is if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist or it can't be managed. This motto has become now the bedrock of so much management. And finally, it goes back to what we were saying initially. Therefore, in this situation, whether we call it sustainable or regenerative, the name actually doesn't matter, because the system itself remains transactional, because the very definition of value remains transactional. And that is the danger, is that once again, we will suddenly say, oh, we need now regenerative or thriving futures, but we actually haven't changed the way we define it.
So I think it's a good question coming through on the chat from Pedro. He's saying, yes, value is key, but does that mean we throw away financial concepts, financial models? And I think this is a big danger with, let's say, the sustainability movement as a whole. Those who want more fundamental reform might end up putting themselves in a bubble and saying we need to create something completely new, be away from the world. How do we do this while we're still embedded in society, while we have, a financial system that we're part of? What do you think, Martin?
Well, I think it's really not an either-or situation. It does. There is value to the system. Sorry, wrong word. There is use to the system that we've created. It does allow for a lot of things, but can we have both? Can we have the same truth, so to speak, or fundamental truth that says if it can't be measured, it can't be managed, and at the same time explore what is the alternative? If it can't be measured, that is because intrinsically it can't be measured, it is immaterial, it is intangible, the origins of value, then it cannot be ignored. How do we bring that back into the equation? I think that is the question that we are fundamentally needing to explore, not to find the solution. Once again, that's the other paradigm. That's the paradigm of fixing things. We have a paradigm that allows us to fix things, yes. And we've also, I think the word anxiety was used earlier. We have more and more feeling of not feeling comfortable, not feeling at ease, feeling anxious. What if we lean into that? What if that is what becomes our new, also a compass to say, well, this is not good enough. This proxy is not good enough. I need more.
Okay. I see that we have one hand up, Colleen. If you can put your comments and questions on the chat, and we'll try and weave them in. But let me come to Pamela in follow-up to this. Do you think that therefore the whole route that we've gone down, which if you look at Europe, is now very much determined by reporting, is linked to this idea that it's all down to what you can measure? Is that a trap we've fallen into? If I were to play devil's advocate, I would say that you don't get to make improvements on the things we care about, whether that be carbon emissions or equal pay, diversity, unless you start measuring and having some transparency around that. So, what are we really saying here? Are we saying we're moving in the wrong direction, or is it just that something's missing?
So I'll respond from the perspective of another colleague who will be joining us tomorrow at the symposium and the dialogue. And that is the question is, are we measuring what counts? Are we measuring what truly matters? And especially when we find that some of our standard measures are focused on primarily on growth and consumption, that brings that question back forward. And it gives, I think, the opportunity for each of us to take a pause and bring that question forward within our organizations. Are we measuring what really matters?
Yeah. And what do you think, Cam? I mean, is it you keep coming back to assumptions? Martin said actually it doesn't matter what label we use, whether we talk about sustainability or regeneration or thriving. So is our attempt to go to what I would think is a different set of assumptions, is something a bit more systemic if we talk about trying to change so that the system itself, meaning the economic system especially, can create something that is net positive, another bit of jargon, but something that actually is good for the system as a whole. I think that is different, but Martin's saying that that has the danger that that could also just be transactional.
And again, we don't know often what our assumptions are. In fact, we are so ingrained with a set of assumptions that frame our notion of reality that we don't even recognize that this is a consensual reality that's reinforced by many of us, operating as if our assumptions are true. And so they go unasked or untested. And this becomes part of the trap we get ourselves in, is we're trying to fix something where the set of assumptions that's reinforcing that is based on an acknowledgement of a reality that is not consistent with the principles of life. And until we are aware of that, we don't even know what to change. So adding more metrics of any kind is an attempt to extend our understanding of our context horizontally. It's not a vertical leap into a new way of seeing the world and seeing each other. So I think until we're aware of the assumptions we're using, we really can't talk about what is the nature of the change that we need to pursue.
Okay. I want to step back a little bit because I have a feeling that the reaction we're getting to sustainability, to ESG, is actually because that the way that we've both communicated but also implemented that hasn't actually benefited those in the system, at least not sufficiently. So my perception is that you're both from the US, so you could probably talk to this better than me, Pamela and Cam, but if we take that as a hotbed of change right now, there is a generation that doesn't feel like they benefited from globalization, and feels also that some of the things that we say are important, like equality and inclusion, they actually haven't benefited from that, or that's how they feel. And that everything we're asking for in terms of environmental protection just sounds like something that's going to cost more money and going to delay their ability to get those basic benefits that they want. They want a better life. They're actually wanting the goal of thriving, which we talk about, but they haven't experienced it. And that's during the same time that we've had this sustainability agenda that was meant to deliver all of those things. And is it that it's only delivered those benefits for developing countries? Is that the problem? Is that why we're seeing the backlash mainly in the US and maybe for different reasons in Europe? So I'm interested. Maybe I'll bounce back to you first, Martin. Am I misreading this? Do you think that it's that sustainability itself hasn't changed the system in the way that it promised, or hasn't benefited those that it said were its beneficiaries?
This is a vast debate, I'd say. But just to take another perspective, just to offer potentially another perspective, what if, rather than a feeling that it has not benefited those in power, because ultimately that's what you're saying, the ones who today have most power, enough. What if rather it is just this growing sense of anxiety, this growing sense of fear that is actually driving this? What if this is more of a survival mechanism, whereby in a state of increasing crisis, well, then those in power are actually pulling out all the stops and saying, this needs to stop because it does not benefit us. Yes, absolutely, it costs us money. And however they frame it, this is about survival rather than about not benefiting from because too much is changing. I think the reality is it's not changing enough. I think if you ask a lot of the developing countries, they'll agree that they've not exactly seen much of the how do you say, the windfall, so to speak, of this. Again, isn't it these underlying assumptions that are actually self-perpetuating, and it is the system that is protecting itself? Obviously, with whatever the system has as its means, which is today power and money.
Yeah, I think you've pointed to something that's fundamental, which is we're living in this very uncertain world. It seems to be more chaotic. It seems to be that we have more risks. It seems to be that we have less control. And when we feel that lack of agency, we do often behave in a way that I might call tribal, right? We look for easy answers from powerful, usually men, sort of big man, strong man theory of leadership. And certainly we look for things that are all about whether this is going to benefit me economically, because that's what I'm struggling with, right? So everything else feels like it's esoteric. It's for those that have the privilege, and therefore I'm not going to get on board with that agenda. Climate change, perhaps I even deny it because, it seems like it's going to inconvenience me and cost more, and all of these arguments that come up, and they're all linked to this idea that people are feeling anxious, people are feeling fearful. Same reason why they will perhaps be anti-migration, right? So all of these agendas that sustainability seems to have picked on are things that I don't know if we've articulated well or we communicated well, that we're trying to bring the solutions to the problems that other people are feeling but experiencing in a different way. Cam, I don't know if you have a perspective on this.
Yes, a former central banker out of Belgium, Bernard Ater, was the youngest member of this club of central bankers when they were working on the development of the euro. And he noted to his colleagues several of the issues with the current system, banking system, money system in a more larger concept. And at some point, one of the more senior central bankers pulled him aside and said, Bernard, we all know the limitations in the system. Our job is to make certain the system doesn't go away. So that's what I'm saying about the fundamental assumptions built into the system. The system is the objective to be reinforced and supported in whatever we do. And Bernard was really trying to point out that there's a shortcoming in the system, as he would say to me, years later. Every revolution starts with, we're going to change everything. But if you look at the history of revolutions in the modern age, in the last 200-300 years, every one of them kept a central bank. So however they wanted to speak to change and transformation, they had to keep a money system that reinforces a certain economic orientation, that reinforces a certain orientation to what is good for all of us.
Yeah. Pamela, do you have something to add on this?
I think ending with what Cam said feels right for me.
Yeah. I want to acknowledge as well that when John Elkington withdrew the concept of sustainability as a failed management concept 25 years after introducing it, he didn't cancel it, right? He said we need to look at this because it's not creating the systemic change that he'd hoped, and perhaps we'd all hoped. And he introduced a second bottom line, triple bottom line, and I'd be interested to know whether you all think this gets to what you're saying, which is maybe starting to change those underlying systemic assumptions. And he said the second triple bottom line, keeping the first three, is that yes, we still need the responsibility element, by which he meant a lot of the, what I would call strategic approaches, the management side, making it part of the business, measuring, auditing, having those codes and standards. All of that, to some extent, is progress, right? We've created some consensus in society around what's important and how we might start to tackle that. But that's only level one. Then he said, and this links nicely to what you're saying about the anxiety and the uncertainty of the world. The second is resilience. We need to now think about sustainability in terms of whether it's helping us to be more resilient in these times of crisis. And if it's not, then probably it's also going to not work, but also be rejected. So if you're going to tell me that for something to be sustainable, I need to pay 3 times as much, that doesn't feel like something that's going to help me to deal with the chaos in the economy of the world. And then the third bit that we come to then for him is regeneration, which is trying to redesign the system to be inherently delivering positive outcomes. So I just wonder whether you think that is still transactional, still not changing the system, or whether that gets closer to something more systemic.
I don't know who you were addressing, but what I think is missing is going back to this definition of value. That is, as long as you've not changed what value is and how and the different ways of measuring value, and accepting that some parts of value will remain intangible, and that therefore you have to relate to them on a personal level. That is the mindset shift that is necessary. That is where actually personal integrity, that's where leadership comes in. This feeling that this is right, this is necessary. I may not quite be able to measure it, I may not quite be able to say it, but if I'm not aligned with what feels right, then I'm missing something. And if all I can say is, oh, I've compensated X tons of carbon, or I've planted so many trees, or whatever that measurement is, does that actually inside of me and within the organization or within the community in which I am, is this something that actually contributes to our well-being, to our feeling better, to our being less anxious, to our being more supportive? That's the final. That's change will come from that shift there. But without that shift, it's just the same system, I believe, that is perpetuating itself. Again, by no ill will, but by the nature of the system.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to just reshare the slides again, because you do put this in terms of 3 challenging questions, and I would invite the participants on the chat to come up with your answers to these questions. So how should we be measuring life, if that's what it's about something that enables us to thrive? How do we measure thriving, as opposed to maybe how we measure sustainability today? And then what I think is a really fascinating question, what do we lose when we can't? Which presumably you mean, if we try to measure everything, what is it that we lose? And I'd be interested in the responses in the chat. And I know Pedro already suggested maybe one of the mistakes is that we're focusing on quantity rather than quality. I think that's a nice way of talking about it. While we get some of those answers in the chat, any further thoughts on whether the additional triple bottom line brings us any closer to a systemic view? Cam, what is your view?
You can see what John has gone through. Is he has been testing his own assumptions and playing with them to try to get at what he really sees now as more the essence of what he was intending. That's the work we all have to do. It's not just get satisfied with any particular definition. It's to kind of work with it and say, how are we getting closer to what we intended by the words we're using? And that's the back and forth iterative process of development. So whatever we're saying today, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong so much as does it open up something? Does something begin to resonate? Do we begin to see something a little differently? And until we're able to be exploratory around this question, we're never going to be able to take a step forward. And I think that is a mindset. This is part of the mindset that I'm talking about here, is that we can't get too locked in around what these words mean until we begin to explore our own feelings, as Martin has been pointing to, in terms of what is really happening to us.
Yeah. And some nice things coming through on the chat on that as well, that maybe it's about purpose, which comes very close to what you're saying, or even spiritual value instead of material value. Mm-hmm. But you have something to add, Pamela.
Yeah, because when we start to, again, things are mindset, things are assumptions, things are paradigms. And when we look at the word regeneration, and especially if we think about how John Elkington was speaking to it, and how he came to some of his ideas through his relationship with nature, that regenerative component also comes with an assumption and a mindset around being in relationship, which is a little bit counter to what has been coming up around transactional. So what does being in relationship look like? What is participating in contributing to the common good in a way that works for us and our organizations? Again, it takes us beyond maybe just a number or a financial, back to that meaning, back to that relationship, which I think is at the heart of regeneration. It's doing it together. It's doing it in partnership with nature.
Yeah.
Not something we're doing to nature.
Yes, yes. I would suggest as well, and I agree with all of that, somehow the relational piece is missing. But I think part of the assumption where we've got it wrong is that we haven't seen sustainability as a kind of design challenge. It's been more of a management challenge, right? So it's been, we've got these big problems, and the way to do it is to do it the same way that we manage quality, or that we manage human resources, or that we manage finance. And so we've had this kind of very transactional system of putting in place, codes and standards and audits and reporting and so on. If you design something to be inherently regenerative, you end up with a completely different system. In fact, you can't make it regenerative without thinking about the system, right? Because if you're in a system, an economic system that's broken, or that is incentivizing all the wrong things, it's very hard to make a product or a service or a company regenerative. So to me, part of rethinking our assumptions is just to think, can we look at the whole system, but then make something so that it doesn't just do a little bit less bad, which is what we often see with sustainability, but actually the more we have of it, the better the world is. And there are very, very few things that we can say are true of that today. And as a result, maybe that's one of the reasons we get a backlash against sustainability, because it really is failing to turn around those basic problems that we're seeing in the world, whether that be climate change or inequality or other things. Any thoughts on that, Martin?
Well, what it makes me think is that because we are in a system that focuses on actually fixing a problem, we're rarely asking what problem we're trying to fix, or rather the perspective that we're bringing to the table when we try to fix that problem. And so even when we are talking about, although I love this notion that, regenerative, once again, it's a word that I love, because it should be systemic. In fact, it should be plurisystemic. And yet, even when we talk about purpose, even when we talk about finding ways of what we're doing this for and who we're doing this for, future generations, and so on and so forth. If we're not questioning what we are solving for and who we're solving for, again, it's very difficult to break out of that separation, dominant perspective. That is key. We can always justify. There's always a good way of justifying. I'm doing this for the greater good. You're suffering, but I'm actually doing this for the greater good. Now, the fact that this greater good, who is really benefiting from the greater good down the line is,
yeah.
So it's again, at what point do we actually take ourselves out of the center of the equation?
Yeah, yeah. And on the greater good, I think the point is as well, it can't be something abstract. It can't be something that is over there for other people, the greater good for other people. Somehow we also have to localize these. If sustainability or regeneration or thriving isn't benefiting, isn't changing my system, and my system could be very local, and it's embedded in a larger system of a city or an economy, then probably I'm not going to be convinced and I'm going to reject it. Maybe one last thought from you, Cam, before I pass to Pamela to start to bring us towards what do we do with this? How do we make this something for us rather than an abstract concept?
So I do think Pamela's got something here to say about how we do that. And so I don't want to go into that specifically, other than to pay attention to this notion of how are we paying attention? What are we noticing? So our observation, orientation to the life around us needs to widen. Our field of vision on the world around us needs to broaden. And that's not going to happen if we are constantly anxious about what's going to happen next. And we're just in our head, thought. We're not in our bodies. We're not experiencing the world around us and noticing our feelings. And I think this is a big part of what's missing in the conversation. We're talking abstractly. We're not talking about our direct experience with things. So this is where anxiety is a good, again, guide back into, well, what is making us anxious? What is going on around us? And talking about that more directly, as opposed to reinforcing what is already present in the system.
Okay, thanks. So to wrap up this part of the conversation, I think, Martin, you also put it nicely here. It really is about two different mindsets. This idea that if it can't be measured, it can't be managed, or the alternative, I like how you put it, if it can't be measured, it can't be ignored. So actually saying what you're saying, maybe the heartfelt, the feeling, even the spiritual perspective, maybe these things, because they can't be measured, are even more important. So let me pass to you now, Pamela, to start to bring it back home to what does this mean for us? How can we take this into our lives and into the world?
Yeah, because what we've really been speaking to is about the different mindsets and the underlying assumptions that are tagged with them. And they're not just the ideas that we hold, but they influence the way we perceive, what we notice, how we view our perception of the world, and how we prioritize and respond. And this shift in mindset, or this exploration into our underlying assumptions, just doesn't occur through better thinking. At its heart, change really occurs through experience. So one of the ways if we can move forward is how do we start to create the conditions for this shift, the conditions to safely explore our assumptions. And a lot of this has to do with slowing down and creating the space for inquiry, to step out of that solution-based mindset, that solution-based conversation, and move from not necessarily what do we need to resolve, but what do we need to listen to? What yet are we not seeing or hearing? What can be seen or heard from another perspective? I mean, it's the question of how much time do you spend with individuals who think differently than you? Are you just in conversation with individuals who will respond, notice, and act the same way you will? Another thing that we can do is we can start to engage in practices that help us to see that larger relational systemic perspective that we've been speaking to. You know, if we start looking at our leadership challenges, our business, our stakeholders, not as isolated problems or incidents or groups of people, but as arising in that wider field of relationships. You've heard us speak to that relationship component, that relational way of perceiving. How do we start to bring more of that into our conversations? And the other thing about slowing down and being, let's say, opening ourselves up to another's orientation or perspective is to be able to sit a little bit with the unknown. This isn't an orientation that we immediately understand. We don't need to rush to a decision, bring it to closure, but we actually take a little time to sit with it and let something percolate. And when we take the time to do this, we might start to notice something. We might start to notice that we can let go a little bit of a certainty. Take a little bit of a pause before we move into answers. Or the opposite, we can move forward without having full clarity. And as I think we've mentioned a little bit before here too, this involves relinquishing some sense of control. And having a relational orientation also means we're in a space of participation. What does engagement look like rather than just fixing on solutions? And in the process, we might begin to see or sense ourselves as being part of the system that we're working to change and develop, rather than separate from it, not acting upon, but building with into something new. And so what we'd like to put then in the next question for the chat is, what would make this real to you? What we've been talking about? What's an aspect of something that you've heard that you can anchor on or explore into more deeply? And what might that small step look like in anchoring and exploring and questioning? And we're just curious to hear from you around that in whatever form you'd like to respond.
And while you do that, a nice link in the chat from Els talking about scenarios, because I think that is one of the ways that we let go of the certainty and that need to control. When you were talking, Pamela, it resonated a lot with this notion of presencing, theory U of Otto Scharmer, the fact that we need to let go, we need to get into this space of unknowing and of uncertainty and the sort of dark valley of presencing before we come out the other side with prototyping and solutions and so on. And that's really hard to do. But I think, as Elsa's pointing out, one way to do that is to think in stories, think in scenarios, because then we're not saying that we either know or can control the future. We're saying it could be this or it could be that. And what would need to change in our lives, in our institutions, in our societies, in order for a particular story of the future to emerge. So, yes, the invitation is on the chat to share with us what could be one thing that you could do or you could imagine yourself doing in your own context, in your own work or life context, in your own organization or community. I see Pedro already talking about community engagement and local solutions. While you do that and you share those in the chat, let me open it up again to Martin and to Cam. So Martin, any response to what Pamela was sharing?
Well, we're completely aligned, and I think maybe another way of just going a little bit deeper and maybe saying it in different words. I think all along what we've been saying is that what needs to change, or what we need to, it's not so much the change is inevitable. We control it more or less. In fact, we are realizing just how little we control it. But it's actually understanding and playing with the conditions of change, which I think is important. And sitting in this unknowing, going through, this presencing of wait, the complexity within which I live, I know I cannot control. So what other ways of relating to it do I have such that I don't fall into the feeling of, impotence or, lack of agency? Because we all have agency. We all act all the time. So how can I once again be on those two levels all the time? The level of an actor and also the level of something where I cannot control all of the consequences of my actions. And therefore, how do I impact these conditions of change?
Right. How about you, Cam?
Yeah, I do like that. We often talk about solutions is what we're seeking to our problems, but oftentimes we don't actually pay attention to this notion of what is that container? What is that context? What are the existing factors or conditions that are at play here that we need to be aware of? Not from the standpoint of saying we need to do something about them, but more from the standpoint of saying we do have choice. We do have agency here. And we need to recognize that in whatever small ways that we may be experiencing it, but not deny the power of that notion that there is choice in how we want to show up in the system that we're existing in. And until we recognize that there is a different way to respond rather than just merely reactive to the pressures we feel, the anxieties we experience, but actually to go into that and begin to recognize, so why is it this way? And maybe I can't influence this context as fully as I like, but how I choose to respond, that's my responsibility.
Yeah. And some nice comments in the chat. Jose saying, also getting beyond the words, getting beyond the buzzwords and the theories, and really trying to go back to how are you showing up in the world. I think that's really important. For me, another part of it is recognizing that the system is changing. So maybe part of the problem is it's an occupational hazard working in sustainability, but we feel like a lot of things are going in the wrong direction. But not everything is going in the wrong direction. So maybe we can learn from the things that are going right, whether that be the spread of renewables or, some of the breakthroughs we do see around labor rights or human rights. And so I think understanding why those have been effective and probably letting go to some extent of the jargon, maybe even banning the S word. And maybe, to be fair, I should then ban thriving and regeneration as well. But to go to the underlying, what is it that makes the system better, that makes it operate without us having to be even moralistic about it, but rather because it's just a better designed system. It's benefiting people. It's a sort of a real solution rather than a sort of cosmetic one. What would be your final thought, Pamela, before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think it is becoming aware of our underlying assumptions and making a conscious choice. I feel like so often in what we've been speaking about today is we're working off a set of underlying assumptions. Let's become aware of what those assumptions are and start making conscious choices around where we want to be going, where we want to take our system, where we want to take thriving, regeneration, sustainability, whatever word we choose. But let's make it a conscious choice.
Yeah. And, although we can often feel like making those individual choices consciously or in our institutions may not seem enough, on the other hand, understanding that we are the system. And so, those deliberate conscious choices accumulate in the system and can become also virtuous cycles, reinforcing one another. They can become part of social movements. They can become part of market movements or policy changes. So, I think it's also realizing that although none of us individually or even as institutions can change the world on our own, we can change our world by how we choose to be in that world and the choices and the decisions and the actions that we make. And we may be surprised, if we do that and if others do that, then in fact, the system itself does start to change. So we're out of time today. I want to thank those of you who joined us. We will, of course, also be sharing the recording. I'd also make you aware that this is a pre-event for an event that runs tomorrow in Porto, where we're looking at thriving futures, and especially the role of AI in innovation, and where Cam and Pamela and Martin, together with another colleague, Lyle White, will be facilitating a leadership dialogue to go deeper into these questions. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our guests, and all the best where you are. Please do stay in touch, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments.